All right. Hey, thanks for coming. And this is our last congregational conversation of the fall. As we've done in the past, we just have a couple short little exercises for us to do. So when we need it, if you need pens or pencils, I can certainly go and grab that. But as we start this, I just wanted to start out with a few reminders because it's not something we often consciously think about. So I want to remind us and bring that into the consciousness that the topic of race is traditionally very hard for white people to discuss. We don't have a lot of experience to it. Maybe I shared the story that after George Floyd happened, someone had asked and said, when your family gets together, how often do you speak of race? And I thought, well, just recently, a lot because of what happened here. But before that, it's not a topic that would come up. And that'd be fairly normal of usually a white family. However, in a lot of black families or people of other ethnicities, it comes up quite a bit because it's something they might deal with regularly. And because of it, they have had a lot of different conversations. And so oftentimes what happens when white people gather and talk about it, we might feel really tense. Just because we're not used to it, right? It's common often, too, for white people to assume we know a lot about most things, but in this subject, we're new students. And so it's good for us to ask a lot of questions. And of course, racism is not a black or white issue. There's myriads of shades of racism, from preferring a white pastor to a Hispanic one to full white supremacy. But they're all rooted in racism. And by that I mean that just because we are against really awful things happening to black people doesn't mean there aren't still small threads of racism that are kind of throughout our country and even inside of us. Having racism is not about whether you're a good or bad person. We weren't responsible for inheriting these beliefs, but we are responsible for changing them. Meaning you can be a very good person who happened to think or say something racist. And that's normal, that happens. And if you're feeling whatever you're feeling at any point, not necessarily today, but in general, when race comes up, just notice that. Nothing's wrong. Just notice that discomfort and continue to do the work. So you're already in groups, and you might have to reconfigure because I believe we have enough people who might have a cell phone on them, but maybe not necessarily at every table. So we want to have someone with a cell phone at every table, and we're going to give you a short assignment. So in the groups, we're just going to take a few minutes, and each of you will have your assignment. So how about... Okay, are we ready? All right. So each group has one thing to report on, and this is kind of like in school where you divide it up and then you share the bounty of your information with everyone. So group A, you want to tell us what you found and how that was for you.
Sure, I will, because I wrote them all down. So it was easy for us to think of black actors. We came up with Denzel Washington and the Manchurian Candidate, Eddie Murphy and Beverly Hills Cop, Halle Berry in Monsters Ball, and Jamie Foxx in Annie. The Hispanic actors were a little harder, but we still could come up with them. So America Ferrera, who's in Ugly Betty, J-Lo in Geely, Cheech and Chong, who were Up in Smoke and in Zootopia, and John Leguizamo in Ice Age. So the indigenous actors, we could not come up with a lot of them by name, other than The Rock and Jason Momoa, who are both like Polynesian. So I don't know if that really counts. But so The Rock is in Moana, Jason Momoa is Aquaman. Then we had to look up more. So a guy named Gil Birmingham is in Twilight and Yellowstone. And then Rosario Dawson, who I have heard of but didn't know she was indigenous, is in 7 Pounds. So,
yeah. So the point of this exercise was to sort of bring up the fact that representation in movies and films has been very slow to catch up with the population. And there's been talk for many years not just about representation, having more Black and Hispanic and Asian and Middle Eastern actors, but also to have them in roles that they have integrity, as well as to have storylines written by and about Black communities, Hispanic communities, Indigenous communities. So for a lot of times you may have a movie that's all white characters, but you have the one from a Black man, or you have an Indigenous person who portrays a Native American, but the script is written by white men, so on and so forth. And so there's just now more conversation about who's writing the part, who's getting hired, who's directing. And maybe you've heard with this new moon, Flowers of a Paper Moon, the new movie that has come out by Martin Scorsese. There's a lot of conversation about that because it does have Indigenous actors who are really, really amazing in there. And it's a story about an Indigenous community that discovered oil and how they basically were, the rich white men came in and did awful things, and it's a historical story. So, but there's just a lot more conversation, I think, now than there ever has been about who's acting, who's writing, who's directing, whose stories are being told, and how are the stories being told. Any other thoughts about that?
One thought I had as I'm looking at these is a lot of like the Hispanic ones. The first things that popped into our heads were that it was just their voice in them. Like their face isn't even in them. They're animated movies.
Oh,
so
interesting.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, we got kind of sucked into even though it wasn't our assigned selection because we talked a little bit about the role of Tonto in Lone Ranger, and I was even thinking that his character was white because Hollywood has had a history of just portraying Indigenous people with Italians or people with darker skin tone and even darkening them up a little bit.
Yeah.
But it turned out that the Tonto who was played, the gentleman who played Tonto in the TV series was Ron Silverheels. That turns out he is an Indigenous Canadian actor. But recently, there was a big to-do about the Tonto that was in the recent reboot of The Lone Ranger, and that was played by Johnny Depp, who is anything but Indigenous.
Right.
Yeah.
That could be a problem.
And that was recent. I mean, it's not like there is a shortage of Indigenous actors.
But that proves the point that, we all have blind spots, and we don't even know we have blind spots. So, if you're doing a project, you're just going to... Do you have your hand raised?
Well, I was just going to say the other thing that I noticed about all the shows that I watched, younger and even somewhat now, luckily it's changing some, is if there was a person of color in it, they were always in a role as the maid, the cook, or some other thing. It was never about a nuclear family, a person of color, rarely. It was always about they were just the workers for the others in the story. So they were not ever portrayed fairly, even when they were in the role.
And there's a long-standing joke that if you have a group of people in a horror movie, the first person who dies is the Black guy. So much that in comedies, when you have a group of people and there's a Black person and they're going to go investigate, the Black guy goes, nope. Gets in the car and leaves because of the trope, right? So it's become such a trope that the first person who dies in a movie is the Black person in the cast. So it's...
Can I just challenge it a little bit?
Yeah.
Like, I also see acting as, like, an art form, and I think historically it's been in a negative way where there hasn't been good representation, but I also enjoy when someone from other races can play a role that's typically white, or, being able to, like, not make race the only reason why someone gets a particular role. So, like, when they rebooted Annie and used a black actress for Annie. Annie in your head is the little red head, right?
Yes,
It's a very classic portrayal and done differently. So I like to see that art can change that, and people from any race can play any role, and even any gender can play any role, and that's kind of historical, where theater males used to play females and vice versa. So I feel like you can kind of pigeonhole too, saying that only Indigenous people can play Indigenous roles. I don't know if that's entirely true if you think of acting as an art form, but
I think actually you're bringing up a really good point. I think
that
you're
balance.
opening it up.
Yeah.
So let me put it another way. And I'm being very generic here, but in the past, movies were pretty much written, directed, and by white men, and the stories were from the point of view of white men. You had your one token woman, and you might have your token black person who may not even have been played by a black person, for example. Moving in the correct direction as I see it, you're getting more stories told, more people represented, of more variety. And there was the question that if you do have one role that's supposed to be Hispanic or black or whatever, can that be someone like who's actually that? Now, as hopefully we're getting much more open, we're realizing that we don't want to keep women pigeonholed in just a woman role, or black people pigeonholed in a black role. We're universalizing their race rather than, remember I said, what's the standard? The white heterosexual man, and anything else has to be quantified. So by having a black Annie or a black Little Mermaid, they're trying to universalize I think that's what I still feel like that's actually progress in the right direction. Yeah. But and the reason why some people get so upset, whether they realize it or not, is because in their mind, no, the norm is a white person and you're taking that away from me. So if that is a racist thought, again, then people go, no, I'm not a bad person. That's not what we're talking about. When we're used to seeing so many people who look like us, and now that's starting to change, that gives us a taste of what maybe other people might be experiencing, where they're used to people always being looking a certain way. It's an interesting conversation. There's a lot here, which is, I'm really glad we got into this. It was actually more than I wanted to get into, but noticing who's on screen, who's telling the story, who got to write it, how it got portrayed, what we're getting upset by, I think is a really good conversation. Anything else?
The only thing I think is earlier when you're talking about that stuff, a lot of that stuff's based on fear. When that was a white role, it's not, not anymore, or something like that. I think somebody's saying that out of fear.
Sure.
Well, it's the control and the money attached to it, and other reasons too, where people want to keep that to themselves, or
Racism is fear, or there's a portion of it.
Yeah. We have yet to see a blockbuster movie where Jesus is actually Middle Eastern. And if we did, how many people would have feelings about that?
Oh, yeah.
So moving on to the next one. We gotta move along here. Something brief about James Cone and Sean Copeland. Who were they?
We'd never heard of either of these. So we're trying to do some basic research. But James Cone was a black theologian. I think he was active in the 60s, known for black theology and black liberation theology, according to Wikipedia. So as far as we could distill it down, it was that the white Christian church was systematically racist and suppressing black people, so they should just exit the white Christian church and have their own liberal, free church that is more consistent with liberation and being free from racism. So they kind of break off and do their thing, influential on Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. That's Wikipedia, so I'm sure there's a lot of nuance there that we're not picking up in our 6 minutes of research.
Yeah.
M. Sean Copeland is hard to unpack. There was a lot of reference to, I guess, her work on structural racism within the Catholic Church. So it sounds like she kind of grew up within the church. May have been a nun. It's hard to unpack. A lot of her quotes are very dense, but there was like a general theme, I think, that she is looking at the kind of inherent structural racism and oppression in our religious institutions, and like how to really be fostering a free individual within like the confines of all the institutions we live under. I don't know. That was a tough one.
And she's a black professor
Yes.
who is currently still teaching and writing. She was retired? Okay, but she's still alive.
Yeah, she's still alive.
Yeah.
Yeah,
She
and
has a very long list of books that she's written.
yeah. Now, if I asked you to write down the names of all the theologians you can think of, I mean, I don't expect it to be a really long list because that's not something that we spend too much time on. But probably they wouldn't be on here. James Cone was someone I never even heard of in seminary, which is really sad because he was kind of a big deal. And he has some really amazing books that came out in the 60s and 70s. So that's just an example of how even my education was, pretty much every book I read was a white European male. And so that's what formed my theology. And it's later that I've tried to diversify that. So anything else about that?
No, no.
You guys maybe had the quickest one. These might be uneven. 2 black-owned businesses in Minneapolis.
Yeah, and so like I said, we got a little distracted with the actors and wanted to go down that rabbit hole. But so I don't know what happened. I did a quick look up, and yeah, it's easy to you start just going to Google Maps and typing black businesses near me. Well, it wants to start answering black restaurants, but I was like, wow, show me the black businesses near me. And one of the things that came up was Minnesota Black Chamber of Commerce, which would be an organization of African American owned businesses. On the other hand, I was disappointed when I went to their website to see that they don't have a nice list of, hey, here's all the black businesses that are members. They just said become a member. So, but there's things like Black Men Winning LLC and Black Business Enterprises, Black Businesses Beautiful Local Market. So there's again restaurants. But it does seem that Google is still skewing towards, no, let's go to restaurants and such. And I know there's more than just restaurants. Heck, Black Men Winnings LLC, that's a financial consultant. And I know that in the Twin Cities there is a black-owned bank that has been interviewed on NPR frequently, and I didn't see them come up. But
there's art business on Penn Avenue.
That's right.
Oh,
Yeah.
and that's owned by black people.
Oh, the art, yeah. Mary Perry.
Yes, thank you.
Think Popeye Chicken there on Glendale.
They've been there quite a few years.
There's a place up on Lowry. I was driving a bus last year, and it's a barbecue rib shop,
Yeah.
and it's all pink. The building, I know that's black owned.
Okay.
and that's one of the, you guys are coming up with these off the top of your head.
I feel like that's a hard Google search too, because like when you take out a business license or whatever, you don't like mark it's not something that's like searchable maybe.
Which is kind of
Unless
they put it in the
unless
name.
it's been right, exactly.
In the name, yeah. and I did that recently. I looked up indigenous owned businesses, and it gets a little tricky. There are businesses now that will put that front-facing, woman-owned, indigenous-owned.
Or
And
if
so
there's
then it-
organizations that want to publicize
Exactly.
that, there may be a list out there, but otherwise,
Yep.
yeah.
But the I want to note that the black owned bank, that was one of the reasons that they were formed was because historically, Black and Indigenous-owned businesses had a hard time just getting the business loans that they needed to get started. And so this bank prioritizes getting the minority-owned businesses that leg up. And
Looks like Minneapolis St. Paul Magazine did an article of Black-owned businesses, and it's pretty extensive. But I don't
Awesome.
know if it's specific to Minneapolis, but the metro area.
Yeah. So speaking of Black businesses, let's go to our last group here, and you can just give us a little summary of the Tulsa Massacre.
Okay, so the Tulsa Race Massacre was also considered the Black Wall Street Massacre, if you've heard of that one instead. It is where mobs of white residents, some who had been appointed as deputies and were armed by the local city government officials, attacked Black residents and destroyed homes and businesses of the Greenwood district in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The attack burned and destroyed more than 35 square blocks of the neighborhood. At the time, one of the wealthiest Black communities in the United States, which is why it became Black Wall Street. But it started because a young white man, a 19-year-old who was a shoe shiner, a black man who was the shoe shiner, was accused of assaulting Sarah Page, a white 17-year-old elevator operator in a nearby Drexel building. And then there were rumors about him to be lynched spread, and so then a group of black men showed up. A group of white men were there wanting to lynch him, and a group of black men showed up at the jail to protect him, and then that turned into where the violence first started breaking out. As I guess one group was, it looks like, by this, they just say that the most widely reported of it, because they don't really know for sure, said that the group of black men were leaving, but an elderly white man approached a black man and demanded that he hand over his pistol. The black man refused, and then the old white man attempted to disarm him, and somehow in that the gunshot went off, and then according to the sheriff's crew, all blank broke out after that. So that's how. But the good news is, it says, goes on to say 10,000 black people were left homeless. But the good news is now, so it never was in any history books. They were just quiet about it. It was never acknowledged. But in recent times, the state legislature has now established scholarships for the descendants of the survivors. And Oklahoma schools have been required to teach students about the massacre since 2002. And in 2020, the massacre officially became part of the Oklahoma school curriculum. So they are actually talking about it now, and it's not swept under the rug like it was back then.
Yeah, it's in the articles in the papers recently too.
Yeah.
I mean, during that massacre, the mobs weren't just mobs of civilians. The National Guard flew off planes to bomb the neighborhood.
Wow.
Yeah, it was decimated. So I bring that up. It's the most famous of that case, but we could spend, quite a bit of time looking up similar things that have happened that have been swept under the rug. And it is, interesting that once again it was the supposed, and we don't know, it was a young black man who somehow did something against a white woman. And there's a whole psychology in our country behind white women and, black men and that whole thing. But that perceived injustice started something so awful. So it's interesting that that's what triggered it.
I think you could say the freeway, 94.
Yeah, I was just looking that up.
Yeah, I was wondering about that too.
Going through was kind of the same thing in some aspect of it. Yeah. Which, and the thing that made me think about it was how they're trying to now make up for it a little bit, which is good because they identified the injustice of.
Yeah.
And I mean,
Is that Rondo?
Yes.
Yeah.
And they were forced out of their homes.
So we can flip this over and just finish up with this last little bit, which is quick. But the point of this exercise was that there's just a lot of of Black history, Indigenous history, that we're not taught or that is simplified or whitewashed. And there's a lot of representation in theology and movies and everything that is still, underrepresented. So part of our doing the work is we actually kind of have to work to find some of these things. And so I just did a quick list here, and I thought, find 3 that you think are actually doable for you. So I'm just going to go down them. Buy items from and support a Black-owned business. Buy anti-racist, multicultural books for yourself and the people in your life. Shut down racist talk whenever you hear it. Learn how to apologize. So if a person of color talks to you and says that what you said was harmful to them, thank you for making me aware of that. I will try to do better. Listen to a Black person's story without minimizing or explaining away their experience. That is a pretty universal experience when Black people will tell a white person about an aggression or microaggression. We'll go, oh, she didn't mean that. Watch movies or TV shows written and produced by Black, Indigenous, Hispanic creators. Pay your domestic workers and caretakers a living wage, or advocate that on a larger scale. Advocate for boards, councils, and committees to be as diverse as possible. Talk to your neighbors, especially if they look different from you. Give reparations, small monthly contributions to nonprofits that support BIPOC people or organizations. And I just listed a couple: the NAACP, the Freedom Fund, or any local organizations that are Black-led. There's a lot of organizations in the Twin Cities as well as nationally. Support public schools, especially those that are Black and brown majority, and don't let people talk bad about them. Center Black voices in conversations about race. Allow for a diversity of Black voices to teach you, not just the one you agree with. There's one person in particular I'm thinking of who conservatives love to quote her because she says everything they want to hear about Black people in America. Many other people around the country who are doing a lot of work in advocacy and have studied race really highly disagree with this woman, but which is why we want to listen to multiple points of view and not just find that one person that we agree with. Discover and read Black authors, artists, activists, etc., etc. When an event happens, seek out what BIPOC leaders are saying. Advocate for voting rights and protest against efforts to redline and or take away voting rights as they target minorities purposefully. And this one made a huge difference for me. Follow BIPOC leaders, authors, artists, and activists on social media. When I started to follow certain people and when something would happen in the world or in our country, all of a sudden I was getting my feed filled with the Muslim point of view, Indigenous points of view, Black points of view. It was different. It was different from what other people were saying. And it really, really helped me to realize how narrow my understanding had been before. So if you're not on social media, that's obviously okay. There's other ways to do it. But I just think it's an awareness piece. Okay, I've heard from 4 white men. Now let's hear from somebody else who might have a very different experience. And then I just listed just a sampling of books and movies. Yeah, but there's a lot out there, and I ran out of space. So. Any final thoughts, because we're at the end of our time?
Well, like for me, working at the school base over there, we have a lot of Black girls that drive our buses and stuff. And they're most of those are one of our best employees.
Sure.
We all get along great.
Sure.
You know?
Sure.
That's a good example of getting together. You know?
Sure, yeah. Making friends with
Yes,
and conversations.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
I wondered how this all changed, because I came to Minneapolis in 1947. I worked for the city of Minneapolis Hospital. I came from all white community, and there were quite a few Black people, and we all got along just fine.
Yeah.
One guy, every time we saw me, would put an arm around me, and one of the ladies, she was Black, and she invited us all to her house, black and white. One evening, we got along just beautifully. We all got along good. How did this change?
Well,
That's a beautiful question.
changing is not the word. I think there have always been examples of black and whites getting together. But what I've learned from the books I'm reading is there's just such a deep history in America from the beginning of racism that's only now people are feeling brave enough to talk about. It's like, why are women talking about sexual assault more now in the last 5 years than before? Did sexual assault just start? No.
No,
It
always.
just
It's been
always. It's just finally they're brave enough to talk about it. I feel like in a lot of ways we're hearing about issues not because they're happening more now. They might actually be happening less now. But it's because we're in a situation in society where people feel safe enough to talk about it. So those wonderful people who you had friendships with, which is great, if we had gone in humbly to a black church at that time and asked them about racism and they felt safe to talk about it, we would have heard stories.
Well, it's been male dominated over the years.
Sure.
With the elections, women didn't know how, it wasn't intelligent enough to vote, you know.
Right.
Now we got women that are professionals in colleges, universities, they're doctors, and we got more women getting involved and ready to speak up. Before they were always put down, you know, like the 1800s and early 1900s.
I think a great parallel is men and women. There have always been wonderful relationships between men and women, but that doesn't mean that there weren't cases where men assaulted women and there were awful situations. Just the women didn't have the power to step up. I think it's similar to that. The wonderful experience you had with these black coworkers where everybody got together. It's just like that. There have always been good relations, but in the whole culture there was built in a system that oppressed black people that they could not speak about because it wasn't safe.
It could have been really, nice that you had this, but as we learned before, there were certain areas in Minneapolis where black people couldn't even buy a home.
Yep.
So
I remember that.
yeah, so that, I mean, right there,
Isn't that always how it is though? Like when a person becomes a person and not a other, it's fine, right? Like I can get along with this person and I have a friendship with this person, but when they're an other, it's easier to do the negative. You know what I mean? Like, and do the oppression and that kind of stuff. And so I think that's kind of part of the answer, right? Is like really becoming involved and seeing people as people and getting to know them on personal levels where it's not just them, they,
And I'll end with this because we're at the end of our time, but that is the first thing that people who are trying to take control and make you afraid of a group of people will do is they change the language and they other them.
Yep.
And so they stop being human beings and they become animals. They become this, they become that. They're all this, they're all that. And then when you're afraid of that group as a whole, who is going to save you from that group? And that technique is being used constantly all over the world and still today with certain politicians in our country. So it's very good for us to, notice that and notice the language of how we're talking about human beings and what's even being reported on the news. Who are the human beings and who are the numbers, So.
In George Floyd's situation of cell phones filming him being choked out is a big factor where he wasn't just a story of this happened to this guy. It's like, here's the video. You can see this guy being choked out by the officers and the other officers holding back the crowd saying, check his pulse, and not do it.
Well, thank you. We're at the end of time. Thank you so much for participating.
thank you.